September 14th, 1950, ships and UN soldiers landed on the sandy shores of Inchon Bay in South Korea. General MacArthur planned to take Inchon Bay back, and if they succeed, it would be a great triumph in the war. This victory was the turning point because it was a huge victory and lead to an armistice. The Korean War, also known as the Forgotten War, started in 1950, but to know the real cause, one must go back to 1900. Japan invaded Korea and took them over. The Korean people were first put into labor camps. The Koreans became slaves to the Japanese people and maids forced into work. There was a period when our nation brought to bear great suffering upon the people of the Korean Peninsula. The deep sorrow that I feel over this will never be forgotten. Akito was quoting court banquet speech welcoming South Korean President Kim Dae-jung, 8th of October, 1996. When World War II started, the Koreans helped build bombs, cars, planes, and other deadly things to help win the war in Japanese's favor. When the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered and was forced back into its original shape, and that meant Korea was free. Then, at the Potsdam Conference, the U.S. decided to establish a border called the 38th parallel, which was a temporary solution in 1948. America was supposed to occupy the South, while the Soviets occupied the North. As soon as this happened, the U.S. put a Korean president, Syngman Rhee, who lived in exile in the U.S., while the Soviets put Kim Il-sung, who also lived in exile but in the Soviet Union. The South went to capitalism, and the North went to communism. In 1948, there were small border disputes over and over between North and South Korea. As the Soviet Union sent troops and tanks to the border, the South knew what was coming, a full war. The South President asked the UN to help if there was ever a conflict, to which MacArthur said, "I will defend Korea as I would my own country, just as I would for California." General Douglas MacArthur to Dr. Syngman Rhee, President of the 2-month-old South Korean Republic, October 1948. As the North crossed the border, the war had begun. I was drafted during the Korean War. None of us wanted to go. It was only a couple of years after World War II had ended. We said, "Wait a second, didn't we just get through with that?" Clint Eastwood in an interview, 1986. They put people in giant gunboats. As they sailed the Pacific, they were ready for a battle. During this time, North Korea took over South Korea's capital and thought they had won the war. On September 14th, 1950, MacArthur and his army landed at Inchon, ready for a fight. Their plan was to go for the capital and then push them back all the way to Communist China, ending the war. They had some things to worry about. One was the tide. When they had to go through the bay, the water was coming out the many islands, so if one of those boats would hit those islands, it would crash and the operation would fail. So they had to go in the morning so there was no high tide, and they could pass through the rocky bay. They also had to note that the fog was rolling in, and if they were still in the ships, they could get attacked from the front, failing the operation. At 7:40, they went through the rocks and many islands, and all of the ships were fine. I realize that Inchon is a 500-to-1 gamble, but I am used to taking such odds. We shall land at Inchon, and I shall crush them, MacArthur told his staff before leaving, 1950. They started bombing the North Koreans. They began firing for 5 hours. At first, they had captured 136 and killed 107. They kept pushing forward, and with heavy bombings, they've killed around 14,000 in the next 13 days. A futile victory at this point in the war. It was a major victory which would require us to fight back and stop the war. The Koreans were very, very afraid because they were close to the border in the South Korean capital. The Americans were moving fast and were getting close. The North Koreans saw this as a surprise attack and very close to 30th parallel. They lost a small chunk of their army as they piled onto the beach with more and more ships and supplies. Danger that the People's Army route of the retreat will be cut off. Therefore, it seems appropriate that the main force of the People's Army should concentrate but maintain mobility. In a telegram from General Ni Xinglang to Zhao and Lai, explaining that they had to retreat or the U.S. would get close to cut them off, killing more of their army. As the North Koreans retreated, it was a triumphant victory for the UN and the South Koreans. After Inchon, the U.S. made a run for the capital. To take it back was the first step in winning the war. They used tanks and land transport vehicles to take the capital. Then they took the capital, Seoul, back in 1950 of December. As they pushed the North Korean army back to communist China, the UN troops thought they had won the war. But then the Chinese army came and pushed them back to the midpoint of North Korea. China fought because they were in alliance with the Soviet Union, and they were in alliance with the Korea. So Stalin asked China to help out, and they did. As the UN troops and Chinese troops kept pushing back and forth, the thought of nuclear weapons came up. Truman did not even want to get close to using it on the Korean peninsula. But MacArthur thought he should use it on China to cripple their forces. He then started to boast and try to scare the Chinese by saying things like, "I would cut them off by their knees if there wasn't for Truman." Douglas MacArthur, 1951. Showing that he was held back by Truman, in December of 1951, President Truman relieved MacArthur from command of UN forces in North Korea, explaining that the general had been unable to give his wholehearted support to the policies of the United States government and the United Nations. Mark W. Clark replaced MacArthur after he was fired. The war went on and remained as a stalemate until the armistice was made on July 27th in 1953. Then both countries went back to the 30th parallel. As this happened, the country set up border troops occupying the border. This became known as the DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone. The Korean War was devastating and had 3 million deaths, and 70% were civilians. This war, but North Korean President Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in have met up. This does not mean the end of the war. Another summit is happening in 2019, this year, in the capital of Seoul. My parents fled from North Korea during the Korean War because they despised the North Korean communist regime. They fled to seek freedom and came to South Korea. Moon Jae-in, the current president of South Korea, 2016. Before the Battle of Inchon, the South Korean people were hopeless and were ready to give up. But when this battle was won, it was a turning point in the war. The UN pushed relentlessly and took back the capital, almost ending the war. It struck fear in the North Koreans' eyes and gave hope that the North Koreans would lose. South Koreans could win this war and be happy again. The UN would stop this war. Other wars would happen, such as Vietnam. But this is the beginning of the Cold War. As Henry Truman said, in the simplest of terms, what we are trying to do in Korea is this: we're trying to prevent a third world war. Henry Truman in an interview, 1954.